Good afternoon. This is the Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship lecture. Adam Banks is our lecturer and our guest right now. My name is Danny Anderson. I'm the interim provost and the executive vice chancellor at KU. We're glad to have all of you here. It's a great turnout. KU has had and continues to have a rich history and tradition of hosting the Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship and this campus-wide lecture to start off the semester each year. Very shortly, I'm going to introduce a variety of our introducers and let you know the things that we're going to do today. First, we'll have Professor Greg Simpson, the interim dean of the college, who is going to share the storied history of the Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship at KU. After that, Professor Farmer from the Department of English will introduce this year's recipient. And after the lecture, there will be some time for question and answer. I would like for you to know that we're videotaping the presentation, and there will be, you will have access to it on the website. It'll be posted on streaming video on the Diversity and Equity website under the Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship link. At about 5 o'clock, we expect for the lecture to conclude, and that will end this portion of the program, but we hope that you will all join us at the end for a reception and a book signing in the Malott Room up on the 6th floor here in the Kansas Union. Once again, I want to thank you for coming, and at this time I want to introduce Greg Simpson, the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Danny. Every time there are microphone problems, I'm reminded of a conference I once went to when somebody said, "Can you hear me in the back?" And a voice came from the back, "No, but don't start over." The Langston Hughes Visiting Professorship was established at the university in 1977 to honor the African-American poet, playwright, and fiction writer Langston Hughes, who lived in Lawrence from 1903 to 1916 and attended Pinckney Elementary. Over the years, the professorship has attracted prominent or emerging ethnic minority scholars to the university campus, involving a very broad range of disciplines and academic departments and schools. There have been a number in the college this year. Professor Banks is from English. We've had several in English, in history, American studies, African-American studies, film and media studies, in addition to music, architecture, and law. The visitor is provided a stipend, of course, and appropriate to his or her rank, a travel allowance, and a modestly furnished apartment near the KU campus. The professor teaches 2 courses in his or her department, and then, of course, has a campus-wide symposium, which is where we are now toward the end of his or her term. A reception following then ensues, as we know. The professorship has not only, it's benefited the entire university community tremendously. It's not only, it's good for the scholars, of course. It brings scholars to campus and gives them an opportunity to continue their research and expand their teaching. It also is good for the university in that it brings us together for a symposium such as this on a very wide range of topics. And it also gives us an opportunity to recruit some outstanding scholars to KU. I'm not sure if I've got my count right, but as I looked through the list of recipients since 1978, at least 7 of them have become tenured faculty members at KU. So it's something that benefits the entire university community. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Frank Farmer, who will do the final introduction of our speaker.
It's my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon the 2010 Langston Hughes Visiting Professor, Adam Banks of Syracuse University. Over the past few weeks, I've had the privilege to become better acquainted with Professor Banks and with his remarkable scholarship, especially his recent work on digital griots, which I understand will form the basis for his talk today. I've also been privileged to witness the inspiring effect his teaching has had on our students, both undergraduates and graduates, many of whom I see are in attendance here this afternoon. Add to this the fact that despite his short time here, Adam has shown himself to be a generous and engaging colleague, and, well, it's not difficult to see why it truly is an honor to introduce him to you today. Now, it's customary in these sorts of introductions to offer some brief and general words about the speaker's work, and because Professor Banks' scholarship is so thoroughly informed by a knowledge of and a sensitivity to music, I thought it might be fitting if I try to situate his work by drawing upon a musical idea or two. Several decades ago, unfortunately I can remember this, the famous composer and conductor of the New York Philharmonic, Leonard Bernstein, sponsored a series called Young People's Concerts, which were, amazingly enough, televised programs designed to introduce young people to the joys of classical music. During one of these programs, Bernstein turned to his solo flute player, Julius Baker, and requested that he demonstrate, quote, a sample of his art. Mr. Baker obliged by playing a single, long, and beautiful note on his flute. After which, Bernstein posed the rhetorical question to his young audience. Was that single note music? Silence, pause. Of course not, Bernstein said. You need at least 2 notes before you can begin to have music, because with that one lonely note, isolated, nothing's happening. It's just floating in space. But once you have 2 notes, you suddenly feel a relationship between them. And there is the beginning of musical meaning. The music of Adam Banks' work sounds 2 notes, and he sounds them clearly and distinctly. The first explores the rich traditions of African-American rhetoric, whether these are to be found in the comparative rhetorics of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, in the communicative designs of Black architects and slave quilters, in the genre of the Black Jeremiad, or in the tonal semantics of African-American discourses. The other note explores the historical moment we all occupy here, a moment characterized by rapid changes in digital technologies, especially in the new media that occupy so much of our everyday and our professional lives. When Professor Banks plays these notes together, as so few before him have done, he finds new meanings for the rest of us. Some of those meanings are harmonious, asking us to regard the innovative ways we might now have at our disposal to resist systemic racism. But some are dissonant too, reminding us that questions of equal access are much more complicated than material ownership, and that the old notion of digitalized space as somehow race or gender or class neutral is not a vision of equality, but is instead a vision of cultural disappearance. Yet, because he is able to embrace at once a tradition that he lives and change that he welcomes, he's able to provide the rest of us with a measured, honest, and insightful account of what happens when African-American rhetorical practices meet new media. Did I say Adam Banks' work sounds 2 notes? No. If you listen closely, you'll hear many, many notes, all expertly arranged. You'll also hear old grooves and new beats, scats and scratches, solos and samples. But mostly you will hear an important new voice in rhetoric and in the academy. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Banks.
There you go. Wow. In the words of Russell Simmons, thank y'all for coming out. God bless and good night. Frankton laid it down, right? The greatest honor anyone can give you is an attentive, thoughtful read of your work. And so, Frank, thank you for such a beautiful and generous reading. To Provost Anderson, to Dean Simpson, to the chair of the English department and the English department faculty, I want to thank you, and especially to my man Fred Rodriguez in the back, for all that you have done to make this sojourn here with you such a warm and such a pleasant one. I've experienced amazing hospitality in so many ways, and so I want you to know how deeply I appreciate that. To the former holders of the Langston Hughes Professorship, including my man, Professor Jelks in the back, including Edgar Tidwell, including the treasure you have in your midst, Miriam McGram, I want you to know how deep an honor it is even to be counted in the number with you, even though my work is far from what you have set for us as a bar. as a goal, as a beacon. And so I could leave it there, but I will add that, beyond being able to be associated with their work, to be brought here in the name of the Bard, in the name of Langston Hughes, not just because I count him a homeboy being from Cleveland, but because Hughes is the person for me who unifies the literary arts, rhetoric, community building, a deep and abiding appreciation and celebration of the beauty of Blackness and Black culture with a broad humanistic vision that connects us all. That's the model for intellectual work that I'm striving for. And honestly, I think that's the model for intellectual work that English studies as a discipline can come together under, where we all feel included and all feel room for our specific gifts, even as we unify around some larger intellectual and curricular aims. So I count it a special honor to be here in his name. Finally, to my partner, to that friend of my mind, my 30 Mile, Candace, thank you so much for traveling to share this experience with me. I'm so happy to have you in my life. There is a slight change to the title for our conversation today. Instead of Rememory, Remixed, I'm going to use the title Mixtape Movement, Reimagining African-American Rhetoric in a Digital Age. Who you with? Was one of late comedian Bernie Mac's favorite opening lines and refrains. Far more than merely a bold, brash line to announce his presence on the stage, Mac entered the messiness of our current, allegedly post-everything moment and immediately called the question for his primarily, though by no means completely, Black audiences. In 3 words, he demanded that audiences locate and identify themselves, declare their allegiances, and simultaneously, he presented his own positionality. Bradford Stull's important book, Amid the Fall, Dreaming of Eden, Du Bois, King, Malcolm X, and Emancipatory Composition, begins immediately with a version of that same question posed with a directness and urgency similar to Mac's. Quote, stated bluntly, immediately, with no appeal to narrative descriptions of oppression, of emancipation, of pain, of joy, here is the question that drives this book. What is the socio-political telos of composition studies? Or put more simply, whom, what does composition serve? In asking those of us in the field to begin any inquiry having similarly located ourselves and our ethical commitments, Stull argues that current discourse in the field allows what amount to 3 choices. What amount to 3 choices? To teach students to uphold the status quo of American ideologies in writing instruction, to declare neutrality in the debates over the political and ethical issues involved in language and writing, or to base one's work in a commitment to changing the current system, to align oneself, quote, with the belief that the study of composition can, should help set the captives free and give sight to the blind. In articulating his ideas of what an emancipatory composition might mean and look like, he grounds his vision in the compositional practices, educations, and texts of W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. Stull argues that these figures represent this approach to composition because their composing practices are at the same time conservative and extreme, adopting a Burkean comic attitude in taking the tropes, commonplaces, and language practices central to American democracy and using them toward the ends of liberation. The comic attitude that allows Du Bois, King, and X to confront the tragedies of a brutal experience and through a sense of irony flip the discursive practices of a language system implicated in those tragedies is radically theopolitical, according to Stull, because their approach to composition simultaneously, quote, roots itself in the foundational theological and political language of the American experience. It is radically theopolitical on the other hand, because as it does so, it calls into question this language and thus the American experience itself. Hence, it is at once conservative and extreme. Stull is interested, therefore, in the synthesis of access and transformation, in knowing the codes and in flipping them in the interest of people those codes were never intended to serve, in the synchronization of innovation and tradition. I want to spend my time today talking about the mixtape as an emancipatory composition practice, about Black theology as a mixtape movement, and a vision for an African-American Rhetoric 2.0 mixtape, a new vision of how we might approach studying this era in a digital multimedia age. My first conscious thoughts about a mixtape of any kind were in the summer of 1983, recording songs off of Club Style, a hip-hop radio program that came on Saturday nights on WDMT 107.9, and my man Josh in the education school will tell you I ain't lying, local radio station in Cleveland. In my own back-in-the-day narratives that my friends and I share about growing up in Cleveland in the 1970s and 80s, we reminisce about football games or dozens sessions. My undergrads learned about the dozens in the last week. That stopped promptly at 6:55 on Saturday nights, no matter what the score, no matter how heated the competition, so we all could run in the house and listen to and record Johnny O's 20-minute workout, an extended set of one of Cleveland's real DJ heroes cutting, scratching, mixing, and remixing songs and breaks. Initially, we just wanted to record those workout sessions, marveling at Johnny O's skills on the wheels, enamored with what was clearly a whole new game musically. But this simple move of straight bootlegging, which I should note, led to props in the everyday knowledge economy of preteen and adolescent kids in the neighborhood and at school, because O played songs that weren't in rotation anywhere else on the radio. This act of bootlegging quickly morphed into an art of creation through selection, arrangement, and compilation. We could record and arrange the songs we liked the most, from Club Style or For Lovers Only, the slow jam session every night, or anywhere else on the radio. The challenges of having to wait for the songs we liked and attempting to capture the entire song before the DJ cut to another song or commercial or began to talk over the outro, those challenges were nothing compared to the fun of feeling like we had become DJs, able to select our favorite songs, arrange and compile them in some way that was ours, that reflected our own growing tastes and sensibilities. So, in the hands of everyday people, the mixtape was an act of vernacular canon formation, deeply personal, yet also part of a public conversation, as other young people talked about their favorite songs, new releases they thought others didn't know yet, their staunchly defended positions about who were the best artists, singers, and MCs, and their own idiosyncratic ways of choosing and arranging the texts, the tracks. Even in our junior high school hands, these anthologies became about the challenge of imposing order on the chaos, the challenge of getting everything that mattered on the two sides of those 60 or 90-minute cassettes. But while millions of young people all over the country, of all races and cultures, engaged in these everyday acts of collage and canon formation, creating party tapes, slow grind tapes, road trip tapes, greatest of all time tapes, and who knows how many other varieties, DJs in the hip-hop game turned the genre into their own art form that circulated in underground and gift economies and challenged the taste-making authority of payola-corrupted corporate media and copyright law that always seemed to side with big money. Jeff Chairman Mao helps to document the phenomenon of the mixtape, its importance to hip-hop, and the ways it reflects the difficulty that lies in the tensions between access, resistance, and aims for transformation in an article that's anthologized in the Vibe History of Hip-Hop. One of the points that Mao's description of Bambaata's classic mixtape Death Mix makes is that even while the DJ uses and arranges other sources in the compilation, The DJ is much more than a compiler, much more than a ventriloquist. She is an artist expected to innovate through her own artistic vision that leads to the elements chosen, how they're mixed and layered, and how they build and speak to various conversations and communities inside and outside the hip-hop game. Mal compares the technological, sonic, and cultural innovation of what he calls the Bronx mixing OGs and their effect on future generations to artists like Jimi Hendrix, Muddy Waters, and Chuck Berry in their innovations with the electric guitar. Similar to them, just as a literary or scholarly anthology is supposed to make some kind of statement of its own in the scholarly conversation, the mixtape must in its as well. So in addition to building the primary tracks of my own intellectual mixtape on the explicit linking of Malcolm and Martin that Professor Farmer mentioned, of Ella Baker and Angela Davis, of access and transformation that Stull advocates, in my time with you today, I want to build onto and extend Stull's argument through an exploration of the rhetorical practices of the one movement in African-American freedom struggle that was explicitly created as an attempt to synthesize the ideological continuum between integration, or what we might better call radical democratic traditions, and black nationalisms. Black theology, the movement built on the legacy and synthesis of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, represents a mixtape moment and a mixtape movement because it links or loops together many of the tracks that mark African-American history and the rhetorical tradition that emerges from it. Malcolm and Martin, radical democracy and black nationalism, a vision of the beloved community for the nation and the world, and of healthy black communities able to love each other and embrace blackness and black history. Black theology's other tracks respond to many of the other continua in the tradition that are often mistaken as either or binaries. And my undergrads can give you this list verbatim. I know they can. Old school and new school. Saturday night and Sunday morning. The block and the rock. In other words, a commitment not just to transnationalism, but to the local as well. Specificities in black experiences and issues and searing intersectional interrogation and critique of sexism, racism, class, and sex oppression. Public discourses and vernacular traditions and practices in the underground. Black theology is a mixtape movement for me because it's intentional synthesizing of important tensions as a guiding principle, and its postures of careful reflexivity and self-critique do not result in a stasis eroding strong postmodern relativism that, for me at least, erodes rhetorical agency. After all, no matter how complex the questions or ranging positions or issues, like Paul Robeson, one must ever always be prepared to say, here I stand. Courses must be designed, assignments created, curricula established, budget and personnel priorities set. Now, black theology studied as a movement is a powerful example of an intellectual and activist mixtape, not just because of these important syntheses, but because its commitment to working across the whole range of continua that mark black experience and struggle does not hinder an ethical commitment that allows it to always answer Bernie Mac's and Bradford Stull's question, who you with? And thus allows for individual and collective action. The downbeat, or the one for my man Tony Bolden and other funk fans out here that brings these tracks together, that makes such wide-ranging syntheses and synchronizations possible, is an unwavering commitment to stand in solidarity with the oppressed and to develop theoretical and activist agendas that serve the broader society, even while working to transform it to foster freedom and equality for those who have been too long denied them. Now, let me be real with you. It would be foolish for me to stand here and romanticize any of the rhetorical practices that fall under the wide cover of the DJ, or the figure that I call the digital griot. The sample, the mix, the remix, the mixtape, and the bootleg are all fraught with difficult ethical questions tugging at the central tensions in African-American rhetoric and Rhetoric and composition as a discipline as well. Copyright or copyleft. Participation or resistance. Civil rights or black power. The genres and practices of the DJ have always been caught up in the same systems of power and capital as any other discursive practice, to such an extent that the DJ and the mixtape have often been subject to their own back-in-the-day narratives. That was a talk I was going to give y'all today, the back-in-the-day narrative. So that's why you hear it referred to there. Africa Bambaataa and Grandmaster DXT, who was once known as Grandmaster DST, and he's also the DJ that you might remember in that 1980s video with Herbie Hancock at the Grammys, Rocket, where he's up there on stage making the turntables a real instrument. They draw a sharp, if double-edged, distinction between a moment when hip-hop and the DJ's craft were more committed to and reflective of an African-American cultural underground. Quote, making rap records tore everything apart. It tore us all apart. This is DXT. That's what killed hip-hop. As far as the culture, it was over, because money took over, and the people who had no knowledge of the culture but had better knowledge of the business aspect got control of the ish, he didn't say ish, and messed it up. Bambaataa co-signs DXT's frustration in his interview with Mal, but he notes the complicated relationships involved in the DJ's move to the mainstream. Yeah, some DJs sold out, allowing their art to become an instrument of global capitalism, authenticating industry-produced artists for fans, expecting those artists to have developed street credibility. Others wanted to see hip-hop grow to influence national and international audiences, so they shared their work willingly with any and everybody who would listen. And yet others were lured into mainstream spaces after the corporate presence had already become a major force in the hip-hop game. Bambaataa says, I had a vision. A lot of other people were selfish and they wanted to hold stuff to themselves. I had a vision to try to make this a whole world phenomenon and movement, and everything fell in place. Mal traces the rest of the history of the mixtape as art form in the hands of hip-hop DJs, noting that it played many different roles. Call and response debates over aesthetics, an exhibition of an individual DJ's technical skills and knowledge of music, a flashpoint in debates over intellectual property as recording industry executives simultaneously wanted to shut down the practice through legal action and yet enlist DJs to create mixtapes to provide buzz and create vernacular authenticity for their chosen artists. Translation, yet another version of payola. And demonstrations of rhetorical ability as DJs use them to show just how hard they could rock a party. So after discussing masters of the art form like Kid Capri, Jam Master Jay, DJ Premier, Biz Markie, Love Bug, Starsky, the Beat Junkies, and the Invisible Scratch Pickles, and he provides a great discography at the end of that article, by the way, Miles sums up the tensions this way. Now, quoting, hip-hop's Darwinian cycle of natural selection has placed its ruthless Mac hand down on virtually every discipline of the culture in some way. Yet, it is DJing which has somehow managed to transcend, reinvent, survive, and flourish. So, of course, these very difficulties and dualities mark the current moment for composition as a discipline in the academy and public arena, as well as African-American rhetoric. All of us on some level or another, we often struggle with the tensions between wanting our work to have some real-world relevance for audiences and communities we care about, attracted to Bell Hooks or Cornel West or Angela Davis model of the public intellectual, and working to earn greater respect through academic spaces that still cling to claims that our work is little more than a necessary service and therefore necessary evil to the rest of the academy. The questions that Africa Bambaataa raises about the ethics that guide or should guide the DJ's work are being asked in all spaces of African-American culture as well, and thus evoke some long-standing debates within African-American rhetoric. Further, the textual layering and the narrative and generational synthesis that are central to the rhetorical forms of the DJ's craft call into question the theme of synthesis itself. In a moment where the tensions between participation and resistance are fraught with such difficulty and in a tradition that is often read through the lens of steep ideological divides, Are there moments or movements that genuinely bring together participation, resistance, and the larger goal of transformation? Now, while many historians have debunked the idea that any movement or activist can be read as a pure exemplar of any one ideology, and I'm thinking about Manning Marable and Leith Mullings in particular here, the debates between integrationist, nationalist, and class-based transformation have been pitched from at least as early as the convention movement of the 19th century and into the present. Further, these debates helped shape much of the early history of African-American rhetoric as a field in the academy, with initial books dedicated to documenting either Black revolutionary rhetoric, as Arthur L. Smith, you know him now as Malefi Asante, as some of his books did, 1969, 71, 72, or the pursuit of the good life of full participation in American society, like Golden and Riki did in their 1972 book, Rhetoric of Black America. I'm here to argue that Black theology is the one movement that moves us beyond the polemic, that offers us a model of synthesis that is not simply a matter of Hegelian agonistic postures leading to a new idea, but as blending and layering the many ideological tracks of Black freedom struggle into a coherent, committed whole, a mixtape movement that offers us a new lens for examining some of the ethical issues not just that Black folk are figuring out right now, but at the center of writing and writing instruction in a digital multimedia age. So, Black theology, a movement whose roots run throughout African American history and across to Africa and throughout the rest of the diaspora, but begun as an explicit movement with the 1966 National Committee of Negro Clergymen, and they were later renamed the National Conference of Black Clergy, their Black Power statement, and this is a statement that was taken out in the July 31st issue of the New York Times, and the 1969 publication of James Cone's Black Theology and Black Power. So the movement been present, going back to the Invisible Institution and long before, but begun explicitly in those moments with the explicit intention of bridging generational, class, and ideological divides among Black people. By labeling it a mixtape movement, I argue that Black theology is the one movement in the tradition of Black freedom struggle whose cause was clearly and intentionally defined, not only through a synthesis, but a rich layering and blending of Malcolm and Martin, radical democratic and nationalist impulses, focus on domestic and Black diasporic concerns, rootedness in Black struggle, but intersectional analysis. But let's get some definitional work done. What is Black theology? The short answer to this question is that Black theology is one manifestation of a larger movement called liberation theology, that it is an understanding of the Christian faith that insists that God is on the side of the oppressed and that one's faith must be made manifest in one's willingness to work for the freedom of people right here, right now, rather than believing in an otherworldly, we'll understand it better by and by notion of faith. Black theology insists that Christ was first and foremost a liberator, and that God takes sides in the events of human history. Black theology also insists that any religious faith must be accountable to the history, needs, and future of the people it serves, and therefore, for Black people, it must embrace and celebrate Black history. Finally, for the short answer, Black theology is a movement that has always been present in the Black church in the voices of people like Harriet Tubman, James Varick, Harriet Jacobs, Henry McNeill Turner, Frederick Douglass, and David Walker, and in many others who refused to accept the assumption that Christianity justified slavery, but began as an organized public movement on that moment I told you about before, July 31st, 1966, when a collection of Black clergy began to bring together those ideas of Malcolm and Martin in order to forge a faith and intellectual movement that were relevant to the contemporary concerns of both civil rights and Black power. There are four important messages here. God is on the side of the oppressed. One must choose sides. There ain't no hiding place. And Christianity is not only about individual salvation, but salvation means the liberation of Black people. Finally, the suffering people have a right to rebel against those forces that oppress them. James Cone, one of the founding figures in this movement, is also clear that Black theology is not merely an indictment of the racism and conservatism of the white religious establishment. he also issues withering critique of the black church, arguing that it is sometimes incompetent and irrelevant for many black people. And I'm quoting him here. How else can we explain that some church fellowships are more concerned with non-smoking principles or temperances than with children who die of rat bites, or men who are shot while looting a television set? Men are dying of hunger, children are maimed from rat bites, women are dying of despair in churches past resolutions. The remix of Cone's statement for the Academy: our classrooms are still not black and brown and indigenous enough. Our students are still tracked out, dropped out, and stopped out. And our professional organizations still pass resolutions. In explaining how he came to these convictions, Cone says he came to link Christ and the Christian faith because, he came to link Christ and the Christian faith with the Black Power movement because, quote, I knew deep down that I could not repeat to a struggling black community the doctrines of the faith as they had been interpreted by Barth, Bootman, Niebuhr, and Tillich for European colonizers and white racists in the United States. I knew that before I could say anything meaningful about God and the black situation of oppression in America, I had to develop a theological identity that was accountable to the life, history, and culture of black people. The question for us before I move on: who are we crafting our intellectual identities to be accountable to? I just kind of want that to sit there. Black theology for Cone and the many other theologians who have committed and contributed to its 40-year history is not only unapologetically Christian at a time when the Christian faith was seen as irrelevant for many black people, but also unashamedly black, identified with black people and black power, completely aware of the depths of anti-black racism and the beauty, power, and possibility in black people. And for my black students who are here, and those of you who added to class a little late, I'm glad you got there that second week. No. I'm not even signifying on them. I'm saying I'm happy because that means somebody went and told them something like, yo, get over there. We got a Hughes here. I want my black students to have a similar sense of themselves as unapologetically intellectual, when intellectual work is sometimes seen as irrelevant to black activism and black needs, and also unashamedly black, refusing to accept the assumption that we somehow have to check ourselves at the door linguistically, intellectually, epistemologically in order to have some success in the academy. In describing Malcolm X's contribution to his own thinking and to black theology as a movement, Cone says, it is one thing to recognize that the gospel of Jesus demands in race relations what it demands in race relations, and quite another to recognize that it demands that African Americans accept their blackness and realize that I could never be who I was called to be until I embraced my heritage completely and enthusiastically. He taught me that a colorless Christianity is a joke, only found in the imaginary world of white theology. It is not found in the real world of white seminaries and churches, nor is it found in black churches. That black people hate themselves is no accident of history. I want you to understand how powerful that statement was in 1969 when, he's talking not just to black people in figuring out where do we go from here, as Malcolm and Martin asked, but to the religious establishment, to the theological establishment. So for black theologians during the 40-year intellectual, activist, and spiritual movement that is black theology, faith was rooted in struggle. It demanded a passionate response to racism. It focused on black unity across denominational, class, and other lines, emphasized black history and culture, challenged conservative black churches, and later in its development, and I want to emphasize, this was later, came to regard sexism, class oppression, and homophobia as issues for action. And that later came, in large measure because of the real challenges of womanist and third world theologians. So, as groundbreaking as I'm arguing black theology was as a movement in the 1960s and 70s because of Cone's polemics and balance of deep love and the sometimes agonistic rhetoric of folks like him and Gay Rao Wilmore, John M. Beatty, Cecil Cone, and others, it would not stand as what I'm calling a mixtape movement, as a powerful example of synchronizing varied traditions and synthesizing dialectical tensions if it were not for Katie Cannon. Nor would the movement stand as a powerful application of black griotic traditions. For those wondering about the word griot, we simply mean storytelling traditions right now, to questions of a liberationist ethics. From the very beginning of her classic book, Katie's Canon, Womanism and the Soul of the Black Community, Canon makes it clear that she intends to disrupt the patterns and assumptions of both mainstream academic discourse and Black theology as a movement. She includes at the very beginning of her preface her vision of her work as bringing both a canon to intellectual academic discourse. In other words, canon ain't just her name, boom. And she says it in the text, boom. And as both creating canons and opening up canons in ways that make spaces for the voices and traditions of Black women, and by extension, for all Black people. One of the most radical acts of mixtaping, of canon formation and transformation that stands as one of canon's most significant contributions in shaping womanist theology and changing Black theology, has been the establishment of Black folk traditions and Black literary traditions, not as things to be included in Black theology conversations or theology and ethics conversations, but as sources and norms for both theology and ethics. Canon created and pursued this reframing of theological work informed by Alice Walker's four-part definition of womanism, identifying her objective and the objective of womanist theology as using Walker's definition, quote, as a critical methodological framework for challenging inherited traditions for their collusion with androcentric patriarchy, as well as a catalyst in overcoming oppressive situations through revolutionary acts of rebellion. My overall goal in this project is, she says, to recast the very terms and terrain of religious scholarship. This recasting of the terrain for canon begins in her own experience, in her own home. She literally begins with her mother's garden in North Carolina and the stories that she shared during violent thunderstorms. During these moments, the family literally disconnected, unplugging everything electrical, turning off all the lights. Some of y'all used to do that, and came together in the stories her mother shared. Canon's mother and her stories continued the work of her grandmother as, quote, a gatekeeper to the land of counterpain. The stories were far more than entertainment or renderings to pass time until the storms passed. For Canon, they were and are, quote, the indispensable source of Black people's historical confidence and spiritual persistence despite all oppression. These narratives are the soil where my inheritance from my mother's garden grew, end quote. For people weary, for people whose history was tied to laws defining any act of distributing print material to Black people as a criminal act. Canon's home and the oral tradition became a folklore sanctuary. This counterculture, this counterpain, not only allowed Black people to survive the blight, to use a phrase that she uses, but to reclaim their dignity and humanity, allowing people, in her words, opportunities to strip away the social absurdity of chattelhood so carefully camouflaged in the dominant culture. In other words, folklore was the mask the slaves wore in order to indict slavery and to question the society in which it flourished. By objectifying their lives in folk tales, Afro-American slaves were able to assert the dignity of their own persons and the invincibility of their cause. Canon's brilliance and innovation, however, came not just in choosing to locate her own life and work in the folk tradition, but in her hacking of the methodological tools of theology and social ethics in the interests of liberation for Black women and Black people in ways similar to the technological appropriation accomplished by DJs in creating and circulating mixtapes, inserting Black music and narrative in resistance to white-controlled media networks and conglomerates driven by predetermined formats, payola, and a willingness to circulate mainly or only those representations of Black people that reified the worst stereotypes. I shouldn't even have that in past tense. And upheld the established social order. To put it differently, if you will, Canon's theoretical, methodological, and interpretive defiance rests in the determination to present Black narrative and oral traditions as sources and norms for doing work as a Christian ethicist. I want to let that sink in. She wasn't using the Bible. She wasn't using Moses. She wasn't using Peter and Paul. She wasn't using Ruth. black folk traditions and black women's literary traditions as the sources and the norms. She makes the case for such a radical reorientation of theology and social ethics by noting that the stories and oral traditions shared in homes and hush harbors were intrinsically connected to prayer. And quote, hence I grew up understanding the black prayer tradition to be the authentic living bridge between black people's stories, black people's music, and black people's source of faith, end quote. Cannon makes the case for folklore and black women's literary traditions as sources and norms for work in ethics and theology by first unmasking the, quote, hermeneutical distortions and racist roots in the history of biblical exegesis, demonstrating that for centuries Western Christianity and the ways in which these distortions mythologize black inferiority, enslavement, and divine will in the explicit interest of maintaining white supremacy. These patterns of interpretation have to be challenged and new canons created because, quote, these same general schemes of oppression and patterns of enslavement remain today, and because the biblical hermeneutics of oppressive praxis is far from being dead among contemporary exegetes, end quote. A womanist approach that recovers the real lived texture of black life and the oral cultural values implicitly passed on, and places black women, their literature, and oral traditions passed down by women at the center of theological work. It's not about developing, as she says, any prescriptive or normative ethic, but about reclaiming agency and demonstrating, and quoting again, how black women live out a moral wisdom in their real lived context that does not appeal to the fixed rules or absolute principles of the white-oriented male-structured society. Black women's analysis and appraisal of what is right or wrong and good or bad develop out of the various coping mechanisms related to the conditions of their own cultural circumstances. In the face of this, black women have justly regarded survival against tyrannical systems of triple oppression, check this out, as a true sphere of moral life. So, in addition to making the case for black women's literature and folklore as sites for the construction of a womanist ethics, Cannon develops the details of one such understanding of ethics, again, not from the Bible, but from the life and work, and my grad students know this, of Zora Neale Hurston. The broad mandate of such an ethics is that, quote, we are called to embrace a holistic justice agenda, casting our lot with the liberation of the darkest women of color, end quote, through a commitment to Morrison's Rememory, even though you didn't get that talk today, to developing, quote, the emotional resources for dealing with forgotten memories that lie dormant in our bodies and therefore in our souls, end quote. Hurston's life incarnated a personality of harmonious, complex opposites, Cannon says. That, and let me continue this again, brings together a personality of harmonious, complex opposites, and her body of folklore and literary work brings together a religion of opposites. And when these opposites are made to coincide, there is the power of new life. There is no room for a false sense of moral perfection when confronting deeply rooted systems of oppression, despite my undergrad's conversation at the end of class today for Cannon. And the ethical treatise that emerges from her mixtape of Hurston's work and black folklore traditions presents four important elements. The first is a primary focus on surviving the continual struggle. The second, finding virtue in what she calls the interplay of contradictory opposites. Finding virtue in that interplay. And the third one, I'll just give you the third one for now, balancing the nuances and complexities of those opposites. So y'all should be hearing the mixing, the layering, the beat matching there, balancing the nuances and complexities of those opposites in such a way that suffering did not overwhelm and endurance with dignity was possible. Because of those commitments, quote, in their tried and tested existential realities, the majority of these women refuse to get caught up in the gaudy accoutrement of the middle-class sham. Against the vicissitudes of labor exploitation, sex discrimination, and racial cruelties, they embrace an ingenuity that allows them to fashion a set of values on their own terms, as well as to master, radicalize, and sometimes destroy pervasive negative orientations imposed by the larger society, end quote. Zora Neale Hurston represents a different model of ethics for a canon, one that is not determined or structured by a Christian tradition that has often cared very little for black people, their concerns, or their struggle to end racism, or the legacies of psychic, economic, educational, and medical pain still tied to racism. Black theology as a mixtape movement and the creative rhetorical work of the mixtape as a writing practice allow for similar reconsideration of the ethical issues surrounding, and sometimes even defining, the scope of writing. There's an old joke among black church parishioners about churches that seem to exist only in order to raise money for the building fund, for buildings that never seem to get built. What happens to considerations of writing and ethics when compositionists worry less about our own building funds, about the limitations placed on us by those that don't seem to respect our disciplinary depth, or about whether our traditional service role contributes to such lack of respect? What happens when we move beyond questions of getting more faculty or TA lines, even though I've raised some of those questions, getting more sections, securing more fair budgets, and decide, along with Bradford Stowe, that composition's primary job is an emancipatory one, or as my mentor, Keith Gilliard, would say, a liberatory one in his examination of Cornel West's influence on the field. When it comes to those questions of ethics in writing and teaching in a digital age, in some ways there is only one ethical question after we address the primary question of access that we're all still struggling with. That is the role that writing and writing instruction continue to play in keeping our universities as homogenized as they still are. After that primary question, there's the question of how the writer, the teacher, and the theorist of writing will deal with intellectual property and copyright issues. And it is in dealing with this set of issues that we got to come back to Mac and ask who you with. Just as black theology as a movement calls Christians to quit worrying about the building fund and stand clearly in solidarity with those who are oppressed and suffering and, quote, refuse to get caught up in those gaudy accoutrements, the mixtape as hip-hop art form calls compositionists to stand on the side of the wide range of different everyday writing practices that have emerged from vernacular cultures into public awareness and into our students' conceptions of what it means to write. Will we stand with a set of copyright and intellectual property codes, laws, and conventions that have pushed more and more severely in the direction of huge corporate interests, or in the interests of students and the public, of everyday people, who have clearly shown that mixing, remixing, and mixtaping, even in working with others' texts, result in new texts, new creations? Will we stand on the side of language practices and evaluation strategies that embrace the rich traditions students of color bring to the classroom? Or will we continue to accept the disingenuous argument that providing students the codes to succeed in corporate society is our only or most important goal? I believe that the mixtape, as it's practiced not only by everyday music fans like I was in the early 80s in Cleveland, but by DJs like Bambaataa, Kid Capri, and many more, calls composition to move beyond our own focus on the disciplinary building fund, calls us to completely rethink our stance toward access and toward copyright on all levels of our professional work. Our approaches to citation practices, definitions of plagiarism, public conversations about what constitutes fair use, the kinds of assignments we create, and many, many more. In short, I'm arguing that we need to adopt, or at the very least, even if we're pragmatists like our president, at the very least, make theoretical and pedagogical space for a copyleft stance toward practices like textual borrowing, photocopying, copy-pasting, patch writing, collage, pastiche, mixing, remixing, and mixtaping. And we're being hypocritical if we don't at least seriously consider pushing toward more open access to texts, images, and sounds and sites for the purposes of recontextualization and academic critique. No teacher can create any syllabus or teach anything without the explicit or implicit borrowing and reuse that DJs have celebrated and mastered. Every course we teach is a mixtape, a compilation of others' texts and ideas compiled, arranged, and combined with our own in various critical gestures we hope will inform and challenge our students. Every scholarly book we write or read is written or read as much for the selection, arrangement, mixing, and interpretive moves a scholar brings to her engagement of other voices and ideas. As for any brilliant, innovative, or dare I say even original argument or thesis we think we might forward, every composition textbook at least implicitly plagiarizes and mixing together various theoretical and practical approaches handed down to us over the years of our experience and thrown into our own blender or mixer, selected and arranged based on our own priorities. And much of the time, even our own teaching on source use and citation and plagiarism itself is bootlegged, borrowed from various sources, often cited, but sometimes not. Finally, the celebrated Kinko's case aside, every teacher and every college professor in the country could be cited for violating the strict policies about photocopying or PDFing text for our students or ourselves that are ubiquitously posted in department offices and mailrooms. But let me move from the specific point about how the mixtape can help us rethink the broader ethical questions that we have to figure out at the intersection of writing and technologies in this moment. And there's a lot more coming in the book for those who, want some of that. And toward, as I close, a few thoughts. If you listen to preachers, they always tell you, I'm about to close about 3 or 4 times before they actually get there. And let me move towards some thoughts about that African-American Rhetoric 2.0 mixtape that I began with. The mixtape as a practice is an example of Katie Cannon's demonstration that the vernacular and literary practices of Black people often show us different interpretations of ethical questions, interpretations that are not dependent upon the assumptions encoded into a culture that has always been dependent on theft. How we get here? DJ culture and the mixtapes they created, gave away, and sold blatantly pointed out both the tensions in our long-standing debates and some of our old hypocrisies. Said to the recording industry, nah, that ain't the pot calling the kettle burnt. Accomplishing this possibility, however, requires far more of the mixtape than simply compiling, arranging, and distributing traditional and new narratives. These acts must be pursued in ways that link tradition and innovation, find value and wisdom in the everyday experiences and lives of Black people and other groups, regardless of the rigidly stereotypical narratives that still circulate in our society, and, as Cannon said, call the question on unequal systems of power. Black theology is a mixtape movement that calls us to critically examine assumptions about what constitutes ethical living, and the mixtape as a rhetorical form that reflects a different set of ethical assumptions about textual creation, borrowing, and appropriation can help us master, radicalize, and sometimes destroy oppressive structures by grounding canon makers in their own communities and traditions. How often does composition do that? Okay. In their own communities and traditions, even as they engage in dialogue with the broader society. It helps to answer Stowe's call for an emancipatory composition because it moves us past rhetorical exemplars and into vernacular communal practices and into greater agency for individual writers to engage with traditions and discourses on their own terms. By moving beyond specific practices, though, and into a broader conception of the purpose, principles, and priorities that the DJ or the digital griot, seen as an important part of the broader griotic tradition, offers understandings of writing in a multimedia age, we see that the DJ and the tropes of mix, remix, and mixtape provide a place from which to begin the work of reimagining African-American rhetoric in a new century. So let me conclude by spending a moment on the larger argument that I'm here to make, that we must imagine an African-American Rhetoric 2.0 as a fully articulated digital humanities project, as a thorough linking of texts, techne, and technologies in the examination of how Black people have engaged in the techno-dialogic, or the mutually constitutive relationships that endure between humans and technologies. By calling for a Black Rhetoric 2.0 mixtape, however, I mean far more than scholars asking, what are Black folk doing online? I also mean something far richer than the American Council of Learned Societies describes in its 2006 report, Our Cultural Commonwealth, in their articulation of digital humanities as a project that, and they say some other stuff, but mainly to quote them, cultivates leadership in support of cyber infrastructure and, quote, encourages digital scholarship. A revised version of African-American rhetoric as a field, as a digital humanities project, for me, certainly means rich, thorough examinations of African-American discourse in technologized spaces, in developing infrastructure and digital scholarship. But for me, those goals just scratch the surface. I'm interested in what Joel Dinerstein and Alex Wehelier identify as black survival technologies. Some of y'all hear the traces of Ellison in there, the machines inside the machine, and a black techno-dialogic. And I'm borrowing that term from both of them. They both kind of come at it, black techno-dialogic, independently. How have, as Dinerstein says, African Americans created the nation's, not just their own, the nation's survival technology? How have black people imagined and reimagined what it means to be in relationship? So I'm talking ontological questions here, right? To be in relationship with ever-changing technological landscapes. Landscapes where, as John Dan Johnson Iolola argues in his book, Data Cloud, they're landscapes where these large-scale changes are difficult to document in the ways we're used to, by charting major history-making or cataclysmic events, because the accumulation of many, many interconnected small changes over long periods of time lead to those wholesale changes that we often don't even notice until we're 20 or 30 years down the road and we're fully enmeshed in them. I hope to see scholars and students explore the complicated ways in which micro and macro level technological developments in American society affect African American life and the discursive production that emerges from those moments. The role of hip-hop offers just one example, one metaphor that shows how we might reimagine our work with Alondra Nelson's and Afrofuturism synchronizing project in mind. Generation 2.0 of African American scholars has done some amazing work using hip-hop primarily through the figure of the rapper or the MC to explain black discursive practices. They've launched needed debates about representation, interrogated systems of power and privilege, and created space in the writing classroom for black bodies and their languages to be respected. In African American Rhetoric 2.0 would continue that work and still have love for the MC, but begin with the DJ and link digital technologies and practices and processes. Notice I ain't talking about just the artifact, right? All right. Practices and processes and all their attendant issues to the questions it raises and the answers it finds. African American Rhetoric 2.0 should still examine issues of representation and language in the lyrics of black music, but as Barbara Garrity Blake does with fish chanties in her essay, Raising Fish with a Song, Technology, Chanties, and African Americans in the Atlantic Menhaden Industry, it would examine prison songs, work songs, and field hollers as powerful examples of both techne and invisible technology that not only made labor like laying railroad track and menhaden fishing possible, but fueled the larger American technological enterprise and, quote, signified, expressed resistance to white authority, signified freedom, end quote, and built community and shared the worldviews of black people in those communities. A couple more examples to get beyond the sort of, hip-hop MC DJ thing might illustrate what I mean here. The famous debates between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, which I should note also involved the Black Women's Club movement, people like Anna Julia Cooper and so many others, about the scope and goals of education for black people, was just as much about the transition from an agrarian to an industrial age as it was about skills versus critical literacies. African American Rhetoric 2.0 would continue to examine this debate. We need more on Du Bois, we need more on Washington, but would also begin to ask how everyday discursive practices and broader attempts to move the people were rooted in the realities of how technological change affected and affects black life, affected and affects individual and communal identities, discursive and persuasive efforts. Ben Williams's masterful examination of the history of techno music in Detroit in the 1980s provides another example. In his essay, Black Secret Technology, he describes the emergence of techno music not only in terms of the sonic and intellectual influences on the music, or the story of how Juan Atkins and other legendary techno DJs used discarded technological tools to create a new music. Williams pursues both of those lines of inquiry, but he also documents how techno's history was deeply rooted in, direct response to, the relationships between race, technology, class, and labor that marked and still mark post-industrial Detroit and the rest of the nation. So, bold, creative uses of technologies, deep inquiry into technology's influences on African-American lives and African-American influences on technologies, African-American survival technologies across eras, digital scholarship, development of cyber infrastructure for studying Black texts and discourses, as the History of Black Writing Project has already been doing, and I'm sure y'all know that. All of these and more are crucial to the development of African-American rhetoric as a 21st century discipline that thoroughly values and thoroughly weaves together spoken, oral, visual, and digital means of persuasion. The combination of the many griotic figures in African-American culture, the storytellers, the preachers, the everyday griots, and their recreations of history and future, the DJs, they offer us a set of abilities and skills, as well as the framework for an outlook that allows us to see writing as serving local communities, as well as the official purposes that we assign to writing in schools and workplaces. This framework includes an understanding of writing and technology as tools to preserve cultures even while planning future agendas. A focus on technologies as tools for reform, resistance, and renewal, as possible elements of a progressive politics of transformation, a set of ethical commitments that requires us to confront systems of oppression and exploitation in solidarity with those who have been, systematically excluded from our society, the ability to produce in multiple modalities, and understand the conventions, possibilities, and constraints of various modalities, a deep and searching understanding of the traditions and cultures of one's community, and a rhetorical focus on being able to move the crowd, which requires, among other things, an ability and willingness to speak across the continua or tensions that mark a particular community at a particular time. Texts, techne, and technologies. Continua instead of merely debates and dialectic. Oral, print, visual, and digital. Healing, celebration, self-critique, and societal critique. Saturday night and Sunday morning. Access and transformation. Mix, remix, and mixtape. Thank you. I happen to believe that if, let's say, if we literally include Black storytelling traditions as a part of education, where, like, if any of you have ever seen a professional storyteller, you know, oh my God, with the ways in which they've mastered performance are just incredible, because the issue is you don't just have to tell that story, you have to make it your own, right? So I can tell you my version of signifying monkey, way down in the jungle deep, the signifying monkey stepped on the lion's feet. But just telling the text, that ain't enough. It's got to be my version of signifying monkey, or back when older brothers and sisters used to toast, right? So what I'm getting at is that I believe, I guess I should try to stay somewhat still, right, since my man's videoing. But, so using folktales and stories in this way might seem to be banal, might seem to be basic. Why would I have some kid doing literacy instruction through Anansi stories, right? But in that process of having to make it your own, one comes to voice. One comes to a confidence about performance and about ways in which they interact with an audience that translate to print literacies, that translate to technological concerns when they've got to write or produce in digital and media spaces. So the first thing is I'm trying to say, rather than see oral, print, digital as these stages of development, right, to see them all being a part of what we're trying to accomplish in the classroom. So that's kind of like the basic part of what I'm getting at there. Yes, ma'am.
Just to piggyback on that, so you wouldn't mind having a student present her paper, if you had them writing a paper in your first year writing class, through a song instead of an actual text, or maybe some text and some songs, singing her way through it.
Future Dr. Fullwood, I absolutely believe that that is an appropriate way of engaging students. So when people ask me how this gets instantiated in the classroom, the first thing I tell them is that most of my assignment sequences, it doesn't always happen this way, but most of them will involve an oral, a print, and a digital text, right? So if I've got them producing some iMovie, there's going to be a reflective paper, there's going to be an argumentative paper attached to that, and there's going to be some piece of that that they've got to be able to present and take that Q&A from their peers, right? And so, but your point, though, about other genres than the academic essay, I'm with you on that, too. Jackie Jones-Royster, another one of my intellectual heroes, she gave a speech at 4C some time ago called Small Boats in a Big Sea, where she's talking about our focus on standardized English and the so-called academic essay, saying, y'all stuck on this little dinghy when you got so many other ways you could travel across this mass distance. Short answer, I'm with you. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I really appreciated your comments about how what we do is so much more a mixed take as scholars than it is original, groundbreaking pieces.
There are a few of those too now and then.
And I really appreciate also your very provocative comments about rethinking intellectual property issues, copyright issues. I imagine that many of us in this room, the wall that we hit in that line is the plagiarism line.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, while we're talking about how this looks in the classroom, what you do with plagiarism issues, or how you approach these issues with your students.
Right, absolutely. First, let me shout out my colleague at Syracuse, Rebecca Moore Howard, who spent more than 20 years seriously pushing academics to rethink intellectual property issues and find some different ways of shaping academic integrity policies that are open to more inclusive kinds of writing. But beyond the shout out to her, let me give you a very nuts and bolts example of what I do that allows me to teach both sides of it, because that's the issue. Students have to understand there are real world consequences, even though, let's be real, a couple of famous presidential historians are still getting paid and still on CNN where Jason Blair got pilloried. Well, yeah, I wasn't, I'll let folks rest in peace. I wasn't referring to that one. But thank you for that anyway. But the nuts and bolts issues, so there are real world consequences. We do have to be real about that. At the same time, so there are times when I will have my students create, let's say if it's something as simple as a PowerPoint presentation or a movie of some kind. Okay, let's post that on YouTube, right? Now if you use any kind of copyrighted music, for the most part, they're going to shut that down and they're going to immediately silence that music, right? So what I try to do in that moment, I'll set the YouTube channel up as private. And I'll say that in this space, where it is only us and only me looking at it, you have the freedom to use anything you want and assemble it in any way you want. Now, what I require as your teacher is thorough documentation of all those sources you used, but you don't have to worry about the conventions of in-text citation for this moment. Anything public, you've got to know these, you've got to know the logic behind MLA. Why is MLA in-text? Why is APA parenthetical? What kinds of comments about ways of organizing knowledge do those citation systems make beyond just policing whether you actually did your homework? So I try to hit the both and. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that. Everybody in early hip-hop sampled James Brown.
That's right. And the rest of them sample P-Funk.
Right. And who sampled James Brown?
And this is why Ricky Vincent calls James Brown the bomb, right? The one.
Right. But Mr. Brown,
yes,
as he was known, was pretty harsh about if you sampled him.
That's right.
There were real consequences about if you sampled Mr. Brown.
That's right.
So how do you explain that to your students?
Well, the very easy answer to that is the celebrated Biz Marquis case, right? Where Biz got taken to court for sampling all kinds of things very freely. And then, in response to all that, he came back with that album, All Samples Cleared. Like, there was that signifying move. That's what I love about black folk. We signify when we need to. But So I cite that case. I talk about that a little bit. What I try to get at, in the case of early hip-hop, right? You have so many riffs, beats, phrases, cliches that everybody uses that are part of communal property, right? Your use of that communal property don't make you wrong. So it's kind of like, it's like the old joke about preachers that I think Keith Miller cites in his book on King, Voice of Deliverance, where he'll talk about how the first time a preacher's up in the rostrum and makes a comment, well, as my good friend Professor Jelks said the other day, the next time he says that very same thing, as a good friend said to me recently, the next time there's no citation whatever. It just becomes his. So in black cultural traditions, there is this space for communal ownership. But at the same time, in early hip hop, what was the worst offense one could make? Biting. You biting my style. You jocking my flow. And so I tried to show them how even in this particular discursive formation, even in this particular community, there were conventions, there are rules, there are understandings. And so I don't do an either or thing with them. I say I want you to have complex reads about how these conventions operate in any community so you know how to flow. Yes, sir. Homeboy.
Hey, what's going on? Question about mentoring. You know, you have such a platform to mentor the next Adam Banks. And I was wondering,
We want to be better than that.
but I was wondering, you know, was there someone who mentored you? Because as we know, you said you look at the percentages of minority faculty across the United States at various universities, excluding HBCUs.
That's right.
The numbers are low, and so when you know, as a minority student that's out there that has the opportunity, maybe sitting in this audience. Was there someone who mentored you, and what's the importance of that?
No doubt. First of all, you heard me shout him out. Keith Gilliard. I kind of joked that I'm Keith Gilliard's intellectual son and Geneva Smitherman's intellectual grandson. And so not just Keith, but this kind of broader collective guidance that I got from a community, not just black scholars, but certainly importantly black scholars in the discipline. And this was a major reason why when I was in Cleveland, man, I'm messing around in the PhD program at Case. There was this Case Western Reserve that was not really organized and not meeting my needs, and I'm figuring out what I'm going to do. Like a whole lot of folks who think they want to study English, what happens? I want to go to Duke. I want to go to Penn. I want to go to Harvard. I want to go to Berkeley. I knew enough from my experience to know I want to go get up under and sit at the knee of a senior black scholar who's going to take interest in my work. I'm going to work with everybody on that faculty. So it was between Penn State and Ohio State because I wanted to work either with Keith or with Jackie Royster, and both of them were wonderfully open to me. And, went and got with Keith, and it was the best thing that could have happened in my academic life. So black, white, indigenous, Latino, what I'm trying to tell you, regardless of racial and cultural issues, don't get all blinded by, some imprint on a piece of parchment you're trying to get. Think about who's going to mentor you. Think about who's going to guide you. You're thinking about a one-to-one relationship with your thesis advisor that is a 10-year relationship at least. Because I definitely ain't letting Keith go, right? So that should be one of your primary factors. One more thing on this, man, because I appreciate that you raised the question. When I think about those forces that helped guide me and help, put things in my ear. So, for example, every now and then, people ask, why are you interested in community work? Why are you interested in community work? My mama and daddy were those mentors even before, because as broke as we were in Cleveland, as crazy as it was living in post-riot Huff, as crazy as some of the stuff even in my own family was, mama was pulling some kids around the kitchen table trying to teach some of them to read. When we went to the park, she was taking them to the park. My daddy was organized in theater groups even if he never graduated high school. So there was a model from the very beginning about literacy and intellectual work as communal work. And when I was an undergrad at Cleveland State, commuting, living at home to save money, there were community activists who made it a point to be up on that campus to get at us. Say, look, as Carter Woodson told us, you don't get an education to make a living, you get an education to make a life. And so having those conversations all throughout, had a big part of it, even though my man Gilliard's influence is central in who I've become as an intellectual. So I appreciate the question, man. You got to be in a community is what I'm saying. However you organize that community, however you find your space, you can't get this by yourself. Let me, undergrads, grads, come on in, y'all. You know how these job talks go. Yeah, the purpose changed, I guess. Maybe I'm being auditioned a little bit, but the faculty, we gonna get a chance to kick it. I want you to feel like you got room in this conversation too. They're like, we gonna see you on Tuesday. We don't. No.
What's for you been the most useful, often turned to technology of survival?
Well, when we talk about how Dinnerstein defines survival technologies, he's talking specifically about Black folklore because that's the space in which people figure out how to navigate the world with those technologies. Within that articulation, so some years ago, I taught a course called Sermon Stand-Ups and Spoken Word. That's my tripartite answer for you right there. My grads are going to read a little bit about the preaching tradition for next week. Yes, sir.
You mentioned scholarship and activism. And I know, because I've quite your class, I've checked out your website. You were talking about...
it's out of date. Don't y'all go there.
But you were saying how, you get mad at sometimes when scholars sort of exploit people they work with on the activism side. So can you talk about how that works and maybe what you meant by that and how the two come together?
In this short story, the names of the guilty will be expurgated to... So I've had some conversations with folk at our annual conference, and they still in the field, so, don't y'all tell on me if you run into them someday. Major books about service learning, about community engagement. And in the book and in subsequent conversations, that person, as the deep and abiding signal of that person's commitment to the people, they said, well, and I've even given the royalties from my book to the organization I worked with. First of all, academic books don't make no money. Even if y'all buy all 20 copies of Race, Rhetoric, and Technology, I ain't seeing 20 cents. So you'll never hear me hawking it because I'd rather give it to you for free. But the point of the story, in spite of that $17 royalty that person might have gotten, that ain't the sign of somebody's commitment. The sign of somebody's commitment is that you out there trying to do the work to build with the people. Even though none of us have permanent answers, we're all learning, we're all wrong sometimes, we're all figuring this out as best we can. It's that ethical commitment I talked about in the talk, that commitment to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering. If one's work does that and builds in a collaborative way that takes their truths, their tropes, their knowledge, their pain, their aspirations, their beauty, their agency seriously, even if it's the slightest, the smallest project, that's beautiful work, right? If it's, I got to get out here and hustle these grants because, and so I think this will work with the National Council for the such and such, and oh my God, this is going to be wonderful when we go out and serve, and, I think there's a difference between those two. And as I had a conversation with some wonderful administrators here yesterday, they are not mutually exclusive. The job of securing resources to be able to do work with the people is important work. I don't want y'all thinking I'm trying to make, some hard-edged distinction here. But a lot of times, there are traps in that system that can pull us away from the work that can be real meaningful. And sometimes the most meaningful work can be free because someone gave their time, their talent, their ability, their commitment in those spaces. That's some of the stuff I'm trying to get at. We got time for two more, I think, before Fred comes and snatches the mic. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was really impressed with how you were able to negotiate the old. A lot of what you did was connected to cultural memory. And
yes.
I think what's really interesting and what needs to be said is a lot of times when people are sort of rooted, to use your word, in a particular genre.
Right.
Let's say it might be bebop or whatever it might be. Their references tend to be specific
That's right.
Culture, you know, that specific time frame. And what you were able to do is talk about the novelty of hip-hop and the concepts that are inscribed within it, and then go back and forth to historical time, and even the profane and the sacred. So with that in mind, could you talk a little bit about the moment when you began to figure, I mean, it's one thing to live it, right?
Right.
In terms of the culture and, you know, your participation in it. But, you know, in terms of, you know, your theoretical, there's a moment when this becomes, you know, gradually clear to you as some of the possibilities, critical possibilities of it. So could you talk a little bit about when you're able to get to that?
When the snaps and dozens became more than snaps and dozens, right? You know, and yeah, there were a lot of these moments for me. Some of them honestly came from, you know, reading Dr. G's work as an undergrad. By Dr. G, I'm talking about Geneva Smitherman. You know, I stumbled upon Keith's book, Voices of the Self. It wasn't attached to any class I was in at all. You know, came on it kind of serendipitously. It's like, wait a minute. Impression management. That's how people navigate the world in order to keep some sense of themselves while they try to participate up in these crazy schools and these. Damn, that's what I was doing, right? So I was about a sophomore. No, I think I was a junior and running for student government president and doing some other stuff when I came up on Keith's book, and it was like, wait a minute, it was a new game there, and I think that led to a lot of how I came to link literature and language study and some of these other areas that we tend to be see as being so separate too, through that example. So there are a lot more of them I can tell you about later, but that was a powerful one. And I've been given the signal. We'll be able to kick it some more in the reception for those who go. I have been directed by the person who is evaluating me most carefully to say that undergrads, I'm sorry, player, y'all can't hang at the reception. I was told I gotta say that. I'm not gonna put the person out there who told me that, but I ain't lying. Yo, amazing energy from all of you. Thank you for your patience, for your engagement. I've had a ball here, and my time here at KU has been nothing short of wonderful. So thank you for that.